Joining us on the line is Clifford May. He is founder and president of Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It was created immediately following the 9/11 attacks on the United States. He's also a veteran news reporter, foreign correspondent, and editor at the New York Times and other publications. He has covered a wide variety of areas around the world. He's also a former Russia-based journalist and attended Leningrad State University at the same time Putin was there. Cliff, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Really admire your work.
So let's talk about kind of where we stand in the Ukraine war right now. The going theory seems to be that Putin is losing the war. It seems a little bit early to say that for me, specifically because it's pretty clear he miscalibrated in entering the war. In the first place, he thought there'd be no response. It would be a cakewalk. But now that he's in it, it seems a little bit early to start declaring victory.
Yeah, look, I have nothing but admiration for the Ukrainians, for the fight they're putting up, but I can't say I'm entirely optimistic. We know what Putin can do. The scorched earth tactics he has used before. He used them, for example, in Grozny against the Chechens. He used them in Aleppo against the Syrians. Now he says, Ukrainians are my brothers, they're fellow Russians. I don't put it past him to do the same thing he has done in these other places, which means to just slaughter them, just raze their cities, men, women, and children, until they submit. Remember, he used a very coarse phrase, a peasant phrase to the Ukrainians. He said, "It is your duty, my beauty," meaning it is your duty to submit to me. And if not, the consequences will be terrible. You may have heard that. And of course, Zelensky came back and said, "We are not yours."
So let's talk for a second about sort of the West response here. So originally, the West failed to deter. I mean, it's pretty clear that since November, October even, there was talk openly by the White House that Putin was about to invade. And now we find out that in December, the White House was presented with the option of putting some military advisors in Ukraine to help them prepare for the possibility of war. And Biden was afraid that that would be seen as provocative and might actually provoke Putin into moving. Obviously, that was a brilliant move considering that now Putin's not in Ukraine. So it worked out great. So once again, it seems that the West over and over and over throughout the Putin regime since 1999, over and over, the idea has been that if we just are nice to Putin in some way, if we keep resetting over and over with him, if we allow him to take over Crimea and there's no long-term response, if we allow him to take over the areas of the Donbass and there's no response, if we allow him to take over Syria and there's no response, that eventually he might turn into a nice guy. The deterrence here failed.
Yes, and to be fair, it goes back even further. We've been giving a salad of carrots and not enough sticks to make a bonfire. It goes back at least to 2008 when he carved two provinces of Georgia. Not much of a reaction when he took Crimea, as you said. Oh, well, it was sort of, we didn't do anything serious. He went into Donbass. There's been a war going on in Donbass since 2014. About 14,000 people killed. We've let that go. Nonetheless, what do you have? You have the Europeans becoming addicted to his oil and gas, and you have the U.S. doing nothing much. And in this year, Biden kind of made it worse. I think he very much made it worse with two things. One is there were two occasions when there were lethal weapons due to go to Ukraine, and he halted them because he thought it might be provocative towards Putin. And of course, we can't forget that last summer, he capitulated to the Taliban. You have to understand when Putin said, look, a bunch of barbarians, they surrendered. He's not going to do anything to me. And the Europeans are certainly not going to. They have hardly any military capacity whatsoever. This is my time. He's also, keep in mind, he's pushing 70. He's got more money than he can ever spend. He's got $1 billion palace. He's got a girlfriend half his age. What does he want? He wants a legacy. And he thinks of himself as a czar. And the czar's proper title was Czar of all the Russias. What does all the Russias mean? It means Russia. It means Belarus, White Russia, which is already a vassal state. It certainly means Ukraine. He's taking back what he thinks his mission is to restore and eventually expand the Russian Empire. That's his mission in life right now.
So given where we are right now, it seems to me that what we've watched over the past 48 hours particularly is Putin now trying to press every weak point in the West. And so what that means is that he's firing missiles near Poland, basically threatening, if you guys keep shipping weapons in, this could widen. He's now said that if they ship MiGs in, then this would be an act of war. He's already said that about economic war. And the West seems to be basically taking that under advisement. The Biden administration reversed itself wholesale last week with Tony Blinken going on national TV and saying, sure, we'll facilitate MiGs entering Ukraine. And then within 5 days, Biden personally intervening and saying, no, we can't send the MiGs into Ukraine because if we send the MiGs into Ukraine, that might provoke some sort of aerial war. So it's not just that the United States and NATO won't provide a no-fly zone, which is arguably the right move, but that we will apparently allow Russia to create its own no-fly zone by shooting down all of these Ukrainian planes without resupplying them with anything that can shoot them down. So he's pressing every button that he can with regard to trying to dissuade the West from shipping in more materiel with the threat of widening the war or even unleashing tactical nukes.
Yeah, I followed Putin for a lot of years, and his modus operandi is essentially Leninist. And it goes like this: you probe with your bayonet. If you feel mush, you march forward. If you feel steel, you move back. He needs to feel some steel at this point. Now, I'm not saying we want to provoke wars. My son is a paratrooper in Latvia right now on the front lines of NATO. We don't want a war with him, but if we show weakness, he will march forward, probing with his bayonet. We have to understand that. And you can have some arguments about whether a no-fly zone makes sense and how difficult that is. You can talk about whether he needs MiGs or more javelins. But at this point, the West needs to stand up and understand that we really do have a threat from him, from his ally, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and of course from the Chinese, which are ambivalent about this, but are not on our side.
So let's talk for a second about the other points of leverage that Putin is attempting here. So he's obviously attempting to use energy as leverage in the same way that basically the Europeans said, well, we will use our leverage against you by cutting off our use of Russian oil and natural gas. Putin is saying, okay, fine, do it. Like really, keep this going and see how long you're going to enjoy these 100% spikes in energy price. Meanwhile, the West is doing very little to up its production other than apparently going to other dictatorships like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela for help. It's difficult to see how Western Europe maintains these sorts of sanctions on Russian oil and natural gas given their current predicament for a particularly long period of time.
It is. And by the way, that was another incentive for Putin to move ahead here when he saw that President Biden had blessed the pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 that he had to Germany, when he saw that President Biden was waging a war on oil and gas industry domestically so that we wouldn't be energy secure or energy independent. When he cut off the Keystone XL pipeline, all that made him think, I have all the leverage here. I can do this. Now, it's going to be painful. Of course it is, for us to stand up to him, but it is doable. We've done some good things with sanctions. There is more to do if you want to implode his economy as quickly as you possibly can. And that should be done and needs to be done. And we need to understand that NATO and the European countries need to be military capable enough to deter. Deter means that your adversary thinks, if I go against these guys, I'm toast. It doesn't mean, oh, this will be a fair fight. I think I can win a fair fight. And we haven't understood this for a very long time. Energy is a problem. As you have pointed out on your shows, climate change, it's a challenge, but it's not an emergency that should dwarf every other challenge we face. And you just saw, I think today, China is going to start upping its coal production and its use of coal. China's not worried about this. So we have to there are things we can do. I think you've also said this, more adaptation than trying to prevent the world from getting 1 degree warmer. But that means we have to utilize our energy resources for the sake of national security. This should be a wake-up call. I don't think it is yet for the current administration. It is a little bit for the Germans, to my surprise, and I'm glad to see it.
So we're speaking with Clifford May of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. So another leverage point. I mean, so they're really trying to push everywhere they can. And one of the other leverage points is obviously with Iran. So they see that the Biden administration really, really wants to sign an Iran nuclear deal for a reason no one can apparently discern, because obviously Iran continues to pursue terrorist activity. Iran's nuclear program has been held at bay by both the sanctions and by, frankly, extraordinary amounts of Israeli intel and action, covert action against Iran. And no one in the region actually wants the United States to open up the floodgates on the Iranian economy and then sponsor their subsidization of terrorism all over the region. But the Biden administration is high on its own supply and wants to re-enter. And when they say re-enter the JCPOA, they mean rewrite the entire JCPOA with different provisions and then call it the JCPOA so they can pretend that it's not an actual treaty that requires Senate approval. Russia is the go-between in this particular effort. And so Russia is now attempting to leverage Biden's desperate desire to re-enter the Iran deal in order to both relieve sanctions on Russian oil and natural gas, and in order to basically allow Iran to open the floodgates. And to that end, they are both negotiating that out in Vienna right now and simultaneously pushing Iran to fire missiles into Iraq near a U.S. consulate in Iraq so that Iran looks like, we're so crazy, look how crazy we are, we're so crazy that we're going to up the terror level unless you sign some sort of deal with us. And Russia's just sitting in the background going, yeah, you got to sign the deal. If you don't sign the deal, it won't get better.
Yeah, the JCPOA, Obama's nuclear deal in 2015, anybody who understands it did not stop the Islamic Republic of Iran from getting nuclear weapons. It at most, and I say at most, delayed it for a few years, kicked the can down the road. At least Obama would be able to say didn't happen on my watch. Now, what they're negotiating now is a weakened version. They promised it would be longer and stronger. It's going to be shorter and weaker, if at all. Really a bad idea. And we should now know that a regime that has nuclear weapons is a serious problem. Look, we would be much tougher with Putin if he didn't have nuclear weapons. And we're tougher, really, with the Soviet Union. Why? Because we had, you know this, we had a doctrine called MAD, mutually assured destruction. We thought, hey, they may be evil, but they're not so crazy as to want a nuclear war. Putin's been clever about saying, look, I may be a little crazy. You see, I may be a little bit like Trump. You don't know what I'm going to do. You better watch it because I might just launch some nukes. You don't really know. And he thinks if he can do that and frighten us, and I think maybe he has, well, then we'll back down. The same thing will happen if the Iranians, or those who rule the Iranians, because I have nothing, I'm very pro-Iranian, those who rule the Iranians get nuclear weapons and get billions of dollars while they are the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and they are threatening their neighbors existentially. They're threatening the existence of Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE. And then Biden goes to the Saudis and says, you know what, if you pump a little more oil, wouldn't that be helpful to me because I don't really want to do it in the U.S. And he goes to Maduro, who hates our guts, and says, you could do me a favor too, and we'll pay you back in some good way. This is not a sensible policy.
So when you look at how this ends, we've said before that there are probably only three separate scenarios here, really. One is that miracle happens, Putin gets couped in Russia, his people say we've had enough of this nonsense and we're done. That is the miracle that everybody is waiting for and is highly unlikely to happen. Possibility number two is that Putin just pursues this war all the way to its end and he just wrecks everything in Ukraine. He ends up installing some sort of puppet dictator, and then he has to fight out a 10 to 20-year insurgency because the Ukrainians are not willing to go quietly into the night. And then situation number three is what is most likely to happen here, which is that Zelensky signs some sort of deal that the West is not completely pleased by. And this is the other thing that Putin is pushing for right here, which is if he can exert enough pressure on the West and on Putin and on Zelensky in particular by killing enough Ukrainian citizens, then Zelensky will basically give him most of the things that he wants, meaning carving off Crimea, carving off the Donbass region, and guaranteeing that there will be no entry into the EU or NATO. And frankly, if you're Zelensky at this point, you have to be thinking, okay, how long do I want this to go on just so that I can have the titular ability to join two organizations, neither of which actually wants me to join them?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, look, I don't want to tell Zelensky what to do. I don't want to tell the Ukrainian people what to do. A lot of us thought it would be more rational to begin with for Putin to go in, say, Donbass is mine, I've had it for years, I'm going to really take it, maybe a land bridge as well to Crimea so he doesn't have to cross a bridge that could be blown up at any point. He'd get a lot of the industrial areas of the country. And yes, Ukraine is not going into NATO. This is a point you've made, and I think it's an important one. You don't flirt with things like going into NATO for years because that makes a country like Ukraine a sitting duck. That's just not the way to do it. If Napoleon said, you're going to take Vienna. If you're going to bring somebody into NATO, bring somebody into NATO. That is a possibility, but I can't claim to know exactly what Zelensky's mind is or the mind of those around him who really do not want to see Ukraine become a vassal state. They believe, and I think they're right, that they are a separate nation, that they're entitled to self-determination. They have an elected leader. They have an elected parliament. I was there in Ukraine for the last elections when the pro-Russian party, and there is a pro-Russian party, got 13.5% of the vote. People were saying to Putin, we do not want you as our master. We are not your beauty. We have no duty to you. We're an independent country. A lot of reasons historically they want that and believe that. And we don't know how far they'll fight for that and what they'll give up. We would hate to, you got to say, Kyiv is a very beautiful city. I would hate to see it razed to the ground. And I'm sure Zelensky would too. So it's a matter of what he'll give up. And it's a matter of what Putin is willing to settle for at this point. And we don't really know that.
I mean, that really is the big question, I think. Final question for you, Cliff. Well, what do you think is the holdup here? Because what Putin has publicly demanded are the things that we've talked about, right? NATO, non-entry, EU, non-entry, Donbass region, Crimea. And all of those are things that Zelensky would not want to give up, but don't seem like they would be wild deal breakers given the situation on the ground right now. There's been talk that he wants to appoint the second in command to Zelensky, which basically is a death threat for Zelensky, because at that point, it's just a matter of time until they poison Zelensky and put in their own guy. But assuming that is that the holdup here? Well, what do you think is the holdup?
Well, I think the holdup is that Putin's demands are not the minimal, and I shouldn't say minimal, but the demands you talk about, which is at least Ukraine comes out of this as a sovereign, independent nation. It loses some of its eastern sector. Maybe it loses the land bridge. They're not going to be happy about that. Mariupol, for example, which has been devastated, is a very important port for them. They don't want to give up Crimea as a matter of principle. I think going into to either the EU or to NATO, they could probably do. But Putin's demands remain maximalist. We haven't heard from Prime Minister Bennett of Israel or others who have negotiated with Putin that he's willing to say, okay, these are my minimal demands. You meet them, and the shelling stops. We haven't gotten to that point yet.
That's Cliff May. He's from the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. You can check out his work over there. He's also in the Washington Times on a fairly regular basis. Cliff, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate the insight.
My great pleasure.